0. Hello, everybody. My name is Siobhan O'Sullivan, and I am delighted to be welcoming you to this session on harnessing responsible neurotechnology for brain health. I think this is going to be a fascinating session as we have a remarkable panel assembled to examine how we can actually harness advances in neurotechnology in a responsible and ethical manner. So, developments in neurotechnology have provided us with really unprecedented opportunities and possibilities. We can now read, stimulate, alter, or even think about how the brain is actually working and gain some insight into what is, I suppose, that last bastion of privacy for all of us. Currently, I suppose the greatest potential of neurotechnologies is in their ability to actually alleviate human suffering through enabling better treatments for mental and neurological disorders. But beyond medical applications, neurotechnologies are also finding their way into other domains, including things like education, workplace management, and even national security. So while we recognize that these developments offer significant potential benefit for human health and welfare, we also need to strike that necessary balance between technological progress on the one hand and respect for human dignity on the others. We also need to ensure that we have the appropriate legal and governance machinery in place to deal with the kind of ethical and social issues raised by neurotechnologies. What we really need are governance frameworks to optimize the chances of stimulating innovation that contributes to human flourishing while minimizing applications that have negative consequences for individuals and society. And I suppose these expansive implications for neuroscience prompted the development of the OECD recommendation on responsible innovation in neurotechnology. And that actually sets out a very helpful set of guiding principles, including the need for trustworthy and agile governance structures, protection of cognitive liberty and autonomy, and attention to social inequality and potential exacerbations of it through neurotechnologies. So these are the kind of questions that we're hoping to address in this session today. Without further ado, I would like to introduce you to our very august panel, which I'm being delighted to chair today. In the interest of time, I won't actually go through all of their biographies because you will find those on the meeting website. But how we're going to run the session is that I'm going to now invite each of our speakers to give us a 5-minute intervention and to give us their thoughts about where the state of play is in this field, in this very exciting field. What are the opportunities? What are the obstacles? What are the possibilities? And how they feel from their particular perspective, informed by their work, the kind of policies we should be thinking about to ensure that we actually reach that objective of harnessing responsible neurotechnology for brain health. So in the first instance, I'd like to introduce Mr. Elvis Schneiders, who's director of the Neuroscience Paris Seine Laboratory at the Sorbonne University in Paris. And I would like to ask Hervé to give us his thoughts on some of these interesting questions. Hervé.
Thank you so much, Siobhan. Well, I am a neurologist and a neuroscientist, so obviously I'm beginning by the great stake and societal goal, which is our health. And everyone knows that the expenses for neurological disease and mental disorders is 1/3 of our expenses in the health domain. Just imagine that Alzheimer's disease is going to represent 2,000 billion in 2030. So you have an enormous amount of needs. Multiple sclerosis is the first cause of handicap in young people, and 13% of the population all worldwide is suffering migraines. So for me, the first thing is to develop available and affordable innovations, and neurotechnology can provide some of these available and affordable, but it's absolutely important to take care of their development and of their cost. Obviously, we see the development of the neurotechnologies outside of the field of health, with big companies like Facebook or Neuralink investing each of them €1 billion to develop either some kind of treatments with brain implants, or for Facebook, some kind of helmet or glasses allowing transcription by thought of a computer screen. So allowing us having no more keyboard. Is it really a societal goal? We can wonder. I am a neurologist, but I am also the chairperson of UNESCO International Bioethics Committee, and the International Bioethics Committee is going to deliver soon now, because it will be by the end of this year, a report on neurotechnologies. And obviously, we insist, as you did, Siobhan, on human dignity, personal identity, freedom of thought, privacy, equal access and distributive justice, risk of discrimination, misuse or dual use or unauthorized use or coercive use, something we have to take into account. Also the dreams of some peoples for augmentation or enhancement. Is it the same, augmentation and enhancement? What does it mean in a society that try to measure everything, but it might be that happiness is not something easy to measure. Questions such as informed consent, and a very special issue we have to deliver for the brain in development, meaning the brain of our children and the brain of adolescents, because they are not small brains, they are brains with developing capacity. So at the end of this report, we call the various partners to do things. First, the Director General of UNESCO to gather multilateral bodies, including OECD, to establish a multidisciplinary group of experts to deepen the gap analysis in neurotechnology governance. And based on IBC report, to pursue towards the development of an international normative instrument addressing the need to protect the neural rights and to complement existing core human treaties. We also call states to many actions, but especially to adopt laws to regulate the use of neurotechnology, because health is highly regulated, but as soon as you use neurotechnology outside, it's not well regulated, even in advanced countries. And especially when it's not used in the field of scientific research, medical needs, or justice. We ask the research community to do many things, including increasing awareness and capacities of research ethics committees to assess and monitor neurotechnology in research projects. Obviously, industry has to do a lot, to start to follow the OECD recommendation 457 and not restricted to the health sector. So to adopt a code of conduct for responsible research and innovation. And especially, it's required to enhance the security. And security is not only the physical integrity, but also the mental integrity. As the enhanced security standard of neuro device, of algorithm, and data sharing infrastructure, and develop a user-centered design. And finally, we call also media to raise awareness on the impact of neurotechnology, and the public to participate, to engage, and to be empowered to discuss these matters, because nothing will be done without the awareness of the public. Thank you.
Hervé, thank you very much. I think you raised some interesting questions there about availability, broad scale availability of neurotechnologies, and also about the challenges, I suppose, of trying to ensure that neurotechnologies can be governed across and cross-sectorally, not just in the area in which they're actually developed originally for. So moving on, thank you so much. I'd like to move on to Diana Saville, who is co-founder and chief creative officer of BrainMind in the United States. Thank you so much, Diana, for joining us this morning. Perhaps you would like to give us our thoughts on some of the challenges in this area.
Absolutely. And thank you so much for inviting me here today on this panel. It's an honor to be here. My name is Diana Saville, and I'm the co-founder and CCO of BrainMind, as Siobhan said. BrainMind is a nonprofit and a community of leading neuroscientists, entrepreneurs, investors, and philanthropists. The mission of BrainMind is to accelerate the most impactful innovations in brain science. So we're creating more hospitable conditions for neurotech advancement by encouraging more risk-taking, attracting best-in-class talent, and funding the science of brain and mind. And people have recognized the need for a community like this. Moving beyond the profit lens addresses a key bottleneck for emerging neurotechnologies. And we now have thousands of members in BrainMind, each participant nominated, each truly in the top of their respective fields, mostly from academia and the private sector. And everyone in this ecosystem is looking to lift up ideas in neurotechnology that are going to be good for humanity. Collectively, there is a lot of buying power, a lot of talent in this group, hundreds of billions of dollars or euros under capital management, similar levels in personal and philanthropic holdings, and a large group of big tech entrepreneurs who are looking for their next meaningful project. So it is an exciting time to be mapping these groups to the brain scientists with ideas that are ready to leave the lab and be brought to society. Our events and our programs at BrainMind, which are designed to make those connections, do put us in a curator role. At some level, we are constantly assessing the neurotechnologies that come across our desks for their potential impact. Do we platform them? Do we not? And we knew that we needed a strong ethical framework to do that properly. So that's what spurred us, with the help of some incredible neuroethicist advisors, to build our responsible innovation initiative and to start planning a category defining summit in 2023, Asilomar for the brain and mind. So Asilomar is going to be a global multi-sectoral conference and a proving ground for implementing the principles that Hervé was speaking of for responsible innovation in neurotechnology. Now that we know, over the past 20 years, thinkers in academia have been deeply considering these questions that are specific to neuroscience. They have been wrestling with the ethical questions. They have identified core values that we should protect, like agency, privacy, access, protection against dual use. And groups like the OECD, who's kindly hosting us here, the European Brain Project, the Brain Initiative in the United States, and others have put out high-level recommendations that lay out these principles. But the danger is that these frameworks remain academic exercises. When we started this Asilomar planning process, we weren't familiar with the guidelines. We thought we'd establish a charter for the private sector. And we learned by speaking with members of our community, the groups who are translating science out of the lab, the scientists, the entrepreneurs, the investors, they're unaware of the guidelines and standards, and they don't understand how to use them or why they need to use them in their day-to-day decision-making. So I don't want to paint a dark picture. I'm actually quite optimistic about the potential to build responsible innovation into the culture of neurotech innovation with efforts like Asilomar. And at BrainMind, we see the opportunity to form that practical layer between conceptual frameworks and their applications. So you might ask, what is the unique offering from BrainMind? We believe it's that connection to private sector. Hervé mentioned this. If you look at where a lot of innovation is happening in this field across big tech companies, Google, Meta, IBM, startups with deep pockets like Kernel and Neuralink, you have to have buy-in from the private sector to build that culture of responsible innovation. So our vision with Asilomar is to bring leaders and influencers together to create new structures, to implement neuroethics frameworks at the level of research, product design, commercialization. We can't wait for regulation. It won't be enough. We really need socially enforced norms in the community. And there is precedence for this working. I would cite the genetics field, we're looking at how Asilomar could become a launchpad for an independent living organization or institution that can help make this happen with a coalition of support around it. And hopefully we'll have time to get into all of that.
Thank you very much, Diana. And you raise really interesting questions there, and the challenges, I think, for us to ensure that governance doesn't become siloed into either private or public domains, but that in fact the governance is that enshrines these values and ethical principles is right the way across all of the development. So thank you so much for that. Next, I'd like to ask Philip Kellmeyer, who's head of Neuroethics and AI Ethics Lab in the Department of Neurosurgery and Epilepsy Center in the University of Freiburg in Germany. So if you could tell us, Philip, your thoughts on this issue and what the challenges, where the challenges lie and how we might best address them.
Thank you so much, Siobhan, and welcome everyone. And before I delve into the specific topic of neurotechnology, because I'm speaking of the perspective as a neurologist, neuroscientist, but also active researcher in neuroethics, I want to stress the importance of other factors for brain health. So brain health, mental health, and well-being need to be considered from a multidimensional and multi-level perspective, in my view. This is important to not succumb to technological solutionism. That is, that we do not always first look at technological solutions to complex multidimensional questions such as brain health. So I want to begin my remarks by stressing the impact of structural and social determinants of brain health to bring that into the discussion also. So for addressing the impact of structural injustices on brain health and well-being, we can distinguish several levels of analysis. So in terms of scale, we can distinguish individuals, groups, populations, but ultimately also the global community. And to improve brain health at scale, we need to understand the impact of specific interventions, whether social interventions, policy interventions, or neurotechnological interventions at all these levels. So regarding the level of individual humans, we have now a multitude of well-established factors that influence and sometimes also determine brain health: genetic and epigenetic factors, postnatal influences, developments across the lifespan, environmental factors, lifestyle choices and habits, such as the level of physical activity, and of course, countless diseases and pathogens that directly affect brain health at the moment, for example, COVID-19. So there are many ways to improve brain health by specifically targeting these areas in medicine and healthcare through specific health-oriented interventions that are tailored to individuals, group, or populations, for example, also from a global public health perspective, which when coordinated well may improve brain health at scale. And importantly, we should also recognize that we need to consider vulnerability and resilience as important cross-cutting dimensions of human existence, both from an anthropological and psychological perspective. And these can also apply to individuals, but also groups, societies, populations. So I want to emphasize the importance of social determinants and structural injustices on brain health and well-being here. Social determinants, in my interpretation, would be shorthand to social, cultural, political, economic factors that have a discernible impact on brain health, well-being, but also mental health and disease. So consider the well-established negative impact on brain health and mental health of poverty, social deprivation, but also consider the potentially positive impact of social bonds, relationships, families, friendships that may help individuals develop resilience to face hardships. And concerning cultural factors, we have evidence that certain cultural practices, food cultures, religious practices, and others have a discernible impact on health in general, and in some cases also brain health. So culture also needs to be considered here. And so in the area of public health, the importance of social determinants for health, well-being, and of course disease is well established, and we need to consider those before we look at neurotechnology. And to address these questions, I would argue that we need a human rights-based and maybe capabilities-based approach. So for the specific questions around neurotechnology, I would distinguish three areas that are important. One is the sort of area of clinical neurotechnology, classical neurotechnologies, if you will, as medical devices. And here we have the challenge that we now have emerging AI-based neurotechnologies that leverage the power of deep neural networks and other approaches from machine learning to better interpret brain activity. And this makes the regulatory landscape much more complex and heterogeneous, for example, in comparing approaches from the US and in the EU. And certain regulatory notions like validation, notions of design freeze are very difficult to meet with these adaptive and learning devices such as AI-based BCIs, neurotechnologies. So this is sort of new regulatory challenges in the medical domain, but we also have specific challenges in the consumer domain in that we need to make sure that consumer neurotechnologies are evidence-based, are based on science, and promote health and well-being and human flourishing, because there's a large regulatory gap now between the sort of not really well-regulated clinical neurotechnologies and completely under-regulated consumer neurotechnology markets, where we have many emerging unvetted devices and approaches. And as a third point, I want to stress that we need also a multi-level governance approach to govern and regulate the use of brain data, specifically in the consumer domain. So these are the three areas, and I would have specific policy recommendations also on all these three aspects in case we get to this in the discussion.
Thank you so much, Philip, and we certainly will get to those very interesting questions. I think you raise a very important point, which is that not to see any technology, in fact, including neurotechnologies, in that through that very sole kind of focus as that's the answer to the problem, but that all of these technologies, in terms of their development and their deployment, have to be seen in the wider social and cultural perspective, and I think that's very important to think about. Next, I'm going to ask Gabriel Villafuente, who's the Chief Science Officer of Actipulse. He's joining us from Mexico, so I'm delighted to ask Gabriel to give us his thoughts.
Hi, everybody. Hello. First of all, I want to thank the OECD for the invitation to this panel. Sayovan, I think I said it correctly, said I'm from Mexico. I'm a medical doctor. I have a PhD in neuroscience. I'm also a researcher in the area of non-invasive brain stimulation. I co-founded, and I am currently the Chief Scientific Officer of Actipulse Neuroscience. Actipulse Neuroscience is a startup that intends, the main objective of Actipulse is to bring neuromodulation devices from the clinic to the home of the patients. We strongly believe that advances in neurotechnology should be affordable and accessible to most of the global population. Developing, groundbreaking technologies only for a small number of people that can afford it is not what we want. Our devices, if safe and effective for home use, will be always affordable and accessible. So I want to start this initial statement talking about the main problems I think that are related to the neurotechnology area. Well, I think that there are two main kind of problems. The present problems that we are facing right now, and the problems that are going to be in the future that we currently don't know what kind of problems will be. There are a lot of problems that are currently here that are important and should be addressed as soon as possible. I strongly believe that we already have the technology ability to change and modify the nervous system in a revolutionary way, in ways that we only dream about decades ago. So regarding these first type of problems that we are facing today, I think the most pressing issue is the lack of accessibility for the whole population to breakthrough technology decided for medical purposes. It is a symbol of disparity in our world. There are a lot of neurotechnologies that are effective, are safe, and are already approved. For example, deep brain stimulation, transcranial magnetic stimulation, but these kind of technologies are only accessible for a small fraction of the population. For example, deep brain stimulation has been in the market for nearly a quarter of a century. Less of 2% of patients with Parkinson's disease have been benefited by deep brain stimulation. For example, transcranial magnetic stimulation has been accepted by the FDA since 2007 as a treatment for depression. However, it's not widely used by medical practitioners due to the lack of insurance coverage. So the cost, if you are not insured of getting TMS, it's simply not payable for an average person. So I think that these are the most pressing issues right now to extend the accessibility of already existing neurotechnologies. I also think that there are another kind of problems that are the problems of the future. And these problems are the ones that I am more worried about. I don't want to be ominous, in this sense. But I have read recently a book by Nassim Taleb called The Black Swan. In this book, he describes what these Black Swan events. And these Black Swan events are events that before the event starts, it's almost impossible to predict that it will happen. We saw these kind of events before these events happen as very unlikely. But after the event happens, these kind of events are very disruptive in a sense. And what is very interesting about these events is that after the event happens, after the storm happens, it is actually pretty obvious why the event happened and why we should have expected it to happen. So I think in neurotechnology we are having these kind of events in the next years. If we could go back, for example, to 2005, before the explosion of social networks, could we predict that a web page used by Harvard students to socialize will disrupt the very roots of our democracy, or create the fake news crisis we currently live? How could we have done things differently? What kind of regulations we could have asked for in that moment? And I think that is what is at stake today. We have that unique opportunity to prevent or at least control these Black Swan events of neurotechnology. So that's more or less what I think are the main issues right now in neurotechnology. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gabriel. That's really interesting. And I suppose I'm fascinated, and we'll come back to it, by your discussion around your point that you made about access to existing neurotechnologies, and that it's not just necessarily a resource issue, but it's also perhaps due to governance. And so I suppose this panel can discuss how do we improve to ensure that we have adequate governance that doesn't actually impede access, but promotes access to the widest possible groups. So on that note, I'd like to go to our final speaker of the panel. I would like to welcome Tarun Dua, who's head of Brain Health, the Brain Health Unit in the Department of Mental Health and Substance Use in WHO. And Tarun would really like to hear your thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you, Siobhan. And coming in, at the end of the panel, I can pick up on some of the points that have already been made. And I wanted to echo what Hervé started in terms of the burden. So I think in terms of, if we look at neurological disorders, they are the leading cause of disability-adjusted life years, and second leading cause of death. This is based on the global burden of disease data. So really, and if we add mental disorders to this burden, we are talking about a huge burden that exists. And we know that there is a need of innovation. There is a need of new technologies to promote brain health, to prevent neurological disorders, to provide better treatment and care, including rehabilitation. So the point that the point I wanted to bring out is that if we look at this data, 75% or more than 75% of this burden exists in low and middle income countries. So the first point is that whenever we think about neurotechnology, let's see how this will be applicable for majority of the people, and the majority of the countries where this burden exists. So that global perspective is very important. The second point, is what actually Philip was talking about, is that as we think about neurotechnology, a public health perspective is required. So there is very often we have the clinical perspective, we bring in the research perspective. We need to bring in the public health perspective, and the dimensions of ethics really come in that. As we are thinking about this, how are we involving people living with these conditions and their families, how their perspectives are brought into that discussion. So I think that's a second point that I wanted to make. The third point is that as we think about the neurotechnology, it's also the currently existing technology. So we have some of these which may sound in today's world like talking about a CT scan or MRI, but let me step back, even talking about the availability of medications. So if we look at dementia diagnosis, or if we look at access for anti-epileptic medications, it is sometimes only 1 in 4 people with epilepsy will receive medications. So we are talking about a huge treatment gap. So there are these huge gaps that exist. So it's the concept of equity is very important, that it is about increasing access to existing technology. And this is also the important consideration as we start having this discussion about harnessing neurotechnology for optimizing brain health. Now coming on from WHO, there are opportunities, and I wanted to bring to attention a new global action plan, in fact, the first action plan on neurological disorders that will be discussed by the World Health Assembly in May 2022 this year. So this will be an important opportunity. And the action plan as the action plans are aspirational, it is talking about promoting and protecting brain health, about preventing and managing neurological disorders. And there are a couple of strategic objectives which I think are very relevant for the discussion that we are having. It's about the issues about the governance, and I think Siobhan, that's very important that as we think about this, that what is the what are the policy recommendations, and I think this panel, the OECD recommendations that are important as we think about it, and then as we think about the diagnosis, treatment, and care pathways, how these can be really embedded. Another point that I think I just wanted to bring onto our discussion is this issue that was raised by Diana earlier about the public-private partnerships. I think in today's world, and especially for these high-burden neurological disorders, it's not a solution that can be by one sector or by one kind of a stakeholder entity. And we need to have better mechanisms of partnerships that need to be in place. Coming on to, and I'm, just that because we are living through this COVID-19 pandemic, one of the surveys that we had carried out in looking at the disruption of services, in more than 50% of countries, there is disruption of services for neurological disorders or mental disorders. And if we look in terms of the mitigation strategies, it's about digital technology. Now, that's currently the way, and that's going to be the way forward, but it is about how all of these solutions can be used, keeping in mind the dignity of people living with these disorders, the privacy issue, and ethical issue. And I think that there's a kind of a learning lab that is existing currently, and we need to utilize that opportunity. And last point is, Siobhan, and I'll give back the floor to you, is just to emphasize that because this is an important area, and then action, we will be looking at strengthening our collaboration and building new partnerships for the implementation of this action plan. that and we really need to engage and mobilize and bring in the experience of the people with lived experience in all of these discussions that are happening. And back to you.
Thank you so much, Tarun. That raises some really interesting questions. And I suppose that's what we're going to spend some of the rest of our time talking about. It struck me when all of you were talking and very rich contributions that it really is a very fundamental question, I suppose, to start off with, which is who is innovation actually serving? And the kind of trajectory of innovation. So do we, is it about setting the goal first? What's the driver? Is there a real need, or is it about finding an application? So I think it was interesting, Diana, you said that you were very concerned with trying to kind of identify and drive those applications that would have the most good for humanity. And I suppose I would start by maybe asking you, how does one identify what's good for humanity? Because the question is, how do we identify those goals and who's part of that process? Because that's actually key and central, isn't it? The inclusivity of actually designing and actually moving through the innovation process. So Diana, do you mind maybe giving us some of your thoughts on that question?
Absolutely. It was a major question as we began to put the pieces together for BrainMind. What was our initial roadmap going to look like for the ideas that we wanted to support, with the knowledge that eventually over time, things would evolve? And we really began to answer that question by going to some of the architects of the large brain initiatives. We went to faculty at top universities, and we asked these questions: what are the areas that, this is formulated in a way that makes sense to our community? What are the areas in neuroscience that are underinvested relative to their importance to humanity? And of course, each individual is going to have a slightly different way of answering that question. And that is the reason why it's such an early stage we brought in, for example, ethicists to also help think about that question. What we arrived at least as an initial draft sketch of a roadmap, is we did identify areas like prevention and early diagnosis, wellness and applications such as educational neuroscience, things that fall outside of the typical scope of what might be funded by large government organizations that tend to focus more on pathology. And then, of course, areas where you've seen a recent, for example, exodus of talent and funding. Early in this panel, Hervé mentioned Alzheimer's disease. And we know that there's been a recent exodus of pharmaceutical companies from R&D in this space because of some failures. And so we identified this as an area of potential just to bring in support. So we have a roadmap of about 6 different areas that we're looking to support, with the full understanding that we're going to be modifying them over time. The main question that we like to ask, we like to bring in levered support. That is the type of thing that really motivates our community. So what we want to do is bring in resources, talent, funding, expertise into those spaces that are just perhaps they need 1 or 2 more experiments to really become viable as products, or they have a slightly longer time horizon than what might meet venture backable criteria, which is really you have to turn a profit within 5 years. You need to be 3 to 10x return on investment. So we look for those sweet spots. Other areas that we're focusing on are large scale efforts to generate and share data, as well as neuroscience informing AI research and vice versa, AI research informing neuroscience. So it spans the gamut. There are a number of different areas that we've identified in a preliminary way. And because we're an ecosystem, because we're constantly having these kinds of conversations in the forms of roundtables, these ideas are evolving as well.
Thanks so much, Diana. And I suppose that is the broader question then to the rest of the panel, I suppose, about what are the kind of policies that we actually need to foster this kind of ecosystem that will kind of support the inclusive innovation, right from the development stage to even identifying what the goals are. Hervé mentioned in his contribution some of the goals you felt might be slightly dubious, Hervé, that there might be some that are more worthy than others. But how do we actually create that kind of ecosystem? What are the policies that we need to start developing and deploying in order to create that kind of ecosystem that's going to give us this kind of innovation that is very much goal-oriented and values-informed? Philip, you mentioned the need for multi-level governance. Do you want to expand on that?
Yes, thank you, Siobhan. The question is that we have to deal with the complexity of the question, the complexity and the diversity. You just mentioned the fact that we need policies, not only policy. Because first we have to face our ignorance in the field of neuroscience. We are still big ignorant of how our brain works. So, and how the mental or neurological disorders develop. It's incredible to see how our brain is adaptable, how our brain manage ourselves with all the surrounding challenge, internal challenge for diabetes, external challenge for change in climate, or a social challenge that lead to a lot of mental disorders. So first we have to develop research. And then we have a diversity of questions, because it's not the same problem for a young person with multiple sclerosis needing some help to return to autonomy and mobility, and some people with Parkinson's disorder, where the question is more the availability of DBS in the forms of Parkinson's disorders, which are not all forms of tremor. For example, DBS is not efficient on tremor, it's efficient on the rigid form of Parkinson's. So complexity of the question in the field of health, and much more in other fields. For example, you mentioned in your introduction education. We have to think about what kind of design of research we have to lead to prevent damaging the brain of our kids when we test new education methods using neurotechnology. Because the clinical trial framework is not adapted for education. We have to rethink a new kind of design for evaluating the efficiency of the techniques in this field. And finally, we need to face the complexity of the various levels of regulation. For human rights, we absolutely need international treaties. And for example, we absolutely need to work out harmonization of data management. In Europe, we have GDPR, but it's only in Europe. It's not applicable to all. And what kind of data are the brain data? They are most likely personal and sensitive data. Is it recognized at an international level? Yes, we have to work at an international level. But if we go to the production, to the security, we need to return to state agencies that have to evaluate the efficiency, the credibility of the question. And finally, we also have to go for the real people on how they use the technique, because very often they are created in one consideration on one field and used in another field or developed in another field. Neurogaming, for example, how you deal with the people that enjoy having some kind of emotion or having some kind of change in neurogaming with their helmet, but the same kind of helmet can monitor awareness and be a tool of surveillance. So we need to face this complexity and not to think that there is one magic bullet. We need to create a real environment of policies.
Thank you, Hervé. I think that's really fascinating. And I suppose maybe I could come to Philip first and then maybe Tarun afterwards. I suppose Hervé has raised the point that if we do have policies, they have to encompass global aspects. They have to span different sectors. It's not just in the medical field, and they have to cross the public-private domain. That's a lot to ask. So any good ideas about what kind of policies are going to be able to do that? So maybe I'll start.
Yeah, thank you. And I can strongly support everything that Harry was saying, what the panelists were saying. And so we are facing a complex problem of multi-level governance and regulation, which is a mix of sort of soft law, ethical codes of conduct, national laws of different kinds, and then sort of transnational laws and agreements like the GDPR, like HIPAA in the US concerning data protection. And how can we make sense of this complex regulatory landscape? It's one question. And I think we need to be very granular and very specific and context sensitive when we start introducing specific regulations. And we have to be sure that we don't misregulate or over-regulate or under-regulate. And so targeted regulation, smart adaptive regulation is really key here. So one example would be, okay, we are now faced with a problem of an emerging consumer neurotechnology market, but no mechanisms in place for scientific vetting of whatever companies are producing and marketing directly to consumers. So one concrete suggestion would be to introduce and agree upon internationally a certification system for consumer neurotechnology devices that includes scientific evidence-based standards, a transparent explanation of the data and algorithms used in the devices, mechanisms for continually monitoring the use of these devices in the population, to also look at emerging risks and unknown hazards. Could have a mandatory reporting system of adverse events. You could have regular audits of the companies producing, disseminating, marketing these devices. So there are a lot of very concrete measures that could be implemented and agreed upon in the international community. And of course, an important aspect, what Heavy also stressed, was the harmonization of different approaches to regulation, especially in the area of data governance. And we've written about this on various occasions. But I want to also stress, maybe if I may, one other point, which was what should be the target of innovation here? And coming back to what I said earlier, if we consider social determinants of brain health, we should perhaps also distinguish social innovation from more technologically driven innovation. So if you can have a policy that can be implemented in many different contexts that lifts whole populations out of poverty, that raises the living standards, that gets people access to clean water and makes sure that their basic needs are met, you already improve brain health on a massive scale because you set the right preconditions for children to fully develop their neurological potential, or for their brain development to not be adversely impacted by things like toxic waste products in water, lead, other environmental toxins. So there's a whole set, like unimaginable, broad and efficient set of public policies that we could implement to massively impact brain health on a global scale. And neurotechnological innovation can then be part of this approach. But as Hervé also stressed, we need to be very specific here and to see, for example, deep brain stimulation, brain-computer interfaces, what kinds of use contexts are really helping a lot of people and are scalable in such a way that they address also and help with the public health needs. So I think we maybe should, investment-wise, look more towards social innovation, and neurotech innovation can be part of that, and it's very important, but may for the time being be restricted to more specific contexts. Dependent circumstances and cannot have the large-scale massive impact that very simple policy measures on a global scale could already achieve.
Thank you so much, Phil. Such interesting thoughts there. And you've already kind of, I suppose, hit upon some of the next questions, which are around what are the concrete things we can do. But Tarun, can I come to you, because being where you are placed in WHO, you have that very global perspective. And I wonder if you could tell us in terms of, you know, what are your thoughts about what are the kind of policies that we need and that you think will actually work?
Thanks, Siobhan. Adding on to, I think, what Philip was saying, well, one of the things is that as we, start working through this policy atmosphere is to have a mechanism of identifying which are the critical gaps that we need to address. So, and using a kind of a theory of change perspective will help us looking at this policy, from that multiple lens in a better way. The second point that I wanted to emphasize is that we have to have good global coordination mechanisms. You know, the world is a village in a sense, and unless and until we have some of these coordination mechanisms that look at these challenges, these critical knowledge gaps, we will not be able to address the challenges. But at the same time, many of these solutions are they need to be tailored or to be contextualized within the local atmosphere of the country. So it is not a one-size-fits-all solution that we are looking at, and I think that has to be reflected in a policy. I'm thinking through again, that there is a lot that we have learned from infectious diseases, and I'm, one of the things actually we are doing within WHO is, and this is for dementia, developing a dementia research blueprint, in a sense that provides some of these issues in an explicit manner. That what are the challenges, how are we addressing, and how do we share the information, how do we share the knowledge, how do we learn from the experience better. So it cannot be a static policy. Also, that there has to be, it has to evolve over time, and sharing of information, sharing of data. I think this will be extremely important as we move forward with this world. I'll come back to the point that I made earlier, that the 2 points actually that I've made earlier, that let's have more and more people from across the world be involved in these dialogues from low middle income countries where this burden is very high. And let's hear from people, let's hear from the families, that what actually are they looking for, and that those voices have to be well reflected in these policies. One of the points I think has been made earlier, but maybe this is where we need to think about that, is this whole of government approach that will be required, because clearly, as we have been discussing, it's not only the health sector, it's not, we are talking about education sector, there is also the employment sector. So what are the ways that these policies for neurotechnology development or disimplementation, they can be mainstreamed in a sense that they do not sit in a siloed fashion? So how do we break those silos that are currently existing? So clearly we have to trace, kind of develop that roadmap, in terms of having that policies for development, but there are specific policies that are also required for implementation and scale up, that address these issues that are related to access, that we are able to get these policies at a price that people can afford, the countries can afford, and we should not forget keeping those access issues.
Thank you so much, Tarun. And I suppose, Gabriel, that's to come back to you then. So you made the very same point, in a sense, about access and the importance of access. So what are the policies that we need to be thinking about that will ensure that these kind of developments will be accessible? and not just from a research perspective or a resource perspective, but from the broader kind of regulatory perspective? What do we need to ensure that they will be accessible to a diversity of people?
First of all, I want to address that innovation should be or should increase the well-being of people of the world. What is well-being in a sense is, well, it's a whole different question that we are not going to discuss. But innovation in neurotechnology should address this, should increase the well-being of the world. And I think policies are not enough for getting to this point. COVID-19 has taught us a lot. It happened something really, really amazing. In less than a year, we got a vaccine that worked for COVID-19. And why did it happen? It was the perfect storm in a sense that all the stakeholders had the initiative to create the vaccine. The public sector, governments, also the private sector, big pharmas, were into getting this vaccine. There was also this urgency from people, from the public, to actually get out of this pandemic. The market size was big enough because maybe there are clinical needs that there are out there. There are a lot of orphan disorders that could be that we could have designed some kind of therapy, but it is not enough a market size for a startup or a company to address this problem. There was also a lot of cooperation between countries, between organizations, between universities. And also there was enough money into getting these new vaccines into the market. Also, obviously, there was the brains of a lot of intelligent people that were working in this. So with neurotechnology, I think that this is something that needs to happen. We need to start thinking about the nervous disorder problems, psychiatric and neurological disorders, something as COVID. There are a lot of people dying right now from depression, from other neurodegenerative disorders, as Health said. We will spend a lot of money, in Alzheimer's disease. So we need to start tackling these problems as global problems, as a problem that is not of just of my interests or the interest of a company that wants to get a drug into the market, but a global well-being problem. So in a sense, I think that the policies should take in count, this cooperation between the public and the private sector, as Diana said. And in a sense, I think we need to change the paradigm in how we tackle these problems. And between all the bad things that COVID brought to the world, I think that this cooperation and urgency to solve a scientific problem in an ethic way and in a quick way could be really, really implemented in neurotechnology.
Thanks very much, Gabriel. I think, Philip, you were making the point that, that's on the face of it, that is absolutely what we should be doing. The difficulty is how we translate that into actual action, because even with the vaccine situation, we still know that there's global equity issues there. So yes, we developed a vaccine very quickly. Yes, high-income countries have vaccinated huge swathes of their populations, and yet we know low and middle-income countries haven't. And that's largely not just due to access to vaccine, but to other more structural infrastructure issues. So I think the same pertains, to innovation and technologies, and especially within the field of neurotechnology. So I suppose the question then becomes about how to concretize all this stuff. So we have some wonderful, the OECD recommendation, we have the work that's now emanating from UNESCO, and I think Diana mentioned earlier, it's fantastic, we have all of this stuff. Most of the people who are funding or who want to become involved are actually unaware of it. So how does it actually become concrete? How do we ensure that the kind of principles and values that we're talking about, that we want to protect, actually are totally integrated from the very outset, from the moment one thinks about development right through to the actual deployment of these technologies. Diana, can I ask you, so from a really, from a concrete perspective, what do you think it's going to take for example, some of the people you're working with? What do we need to do in terms of the policies and recommendations to actually make them real?
So actually what you're describing is the need for responsible innovation to be properly positioned in terms of the incentives of these different stakeholder groups. We've actually spent the last year probing that very question, because we understood that it's the community of investors who are putting billions of dollars into this space. They don't automatically see that they have a role to play in this process. We spoke to these investors. They typically see, when they think about ethics, they think about their personal ethics. They think about how they treat their entrepreneurs. They think about their fiduciary responsibility to get a maximized profit. They're not necessarily thinking about the potential impact of the technologies. Mostly they want to make sure that it's scientifically valid, it's going to do what it says it's going to do. And often, as Gabrielle pointed out, the black swan argument is trotted out. It's impossible to predict any of these potential negative outcomes. Well, we have actually a precedent. You have the advent of social media and the drift toward negative outcomes, where everyone thought that social media was going to connect everyone. We're seeing now that it's doing the opposite in many cases. We're understanding how privacy can be invaded. We understand how autonomy is starting to shift because of all the data that's being collected. And so it's actually interesting. The investors, you have to make a value proposition to them. And for entrepreneurs, another example, they have massive competing pressures. They are trying to raise their next round of capital. They are trying to make sure their product hits their next milestone. For them, it's a resource and time constraint. They actually understand the value of bringing responsible innovation into their decision-making. They don't know how to do it. And what they're really looking for is a shortcut. They want to look at what Google is doing and just use that as general guardrails for how to behave. So that leads me to these large private sector tech companies that have been awakened. Cambridge Analytica scandal, they've been awakened to the fact that the public is watching, that they need to be thinking about these questions ahead of time. And having spoken to executives and heads of research at these types of organizations, they're more than willing to find ways to incorporate responsible innovation into what they're doing, which will have that effect of being an avatar or being an exemplar. The issue is that, first of all, some of these leaders, they hear this concept of yet another committee and they sort of want to back away from that because, of course, many of these people have science backgrounds and they're ethically driven to bring innovations forward to help others. And then, but there is this a slight tension where large tech companies also want to embrace regulation, not in order to make sure the innovation is responsible, but as a barrier to entry for future competition. So working with these groups is like walking a tightrope, but I really believe it's worthwhile and it can be done.
Thank you, Diane. That's really interesting. Some interesting insights there from you. I wonder if I can maybe ask Hervé, since UNESCO is doing work in this, I mean, your group must have thought about it's important to produce this, but how are you going to embed the principles you're talking about? So I wonder if you could share some of your thoughts, Hervé, in respect of that.
Well, we are in our report, we are making a lot of recommendations, almost more than 10 recommendations for each of the actors, international bodies, states, industry, the research sector, the media and the public. But I think that we need to name a cat, and especially after what Diane said, it's clear that all the actors are very good will and good faith, but the reality is that we face monopolies. If we are feared of companies like GAFAM, it's because they have an incredible power today, and we have also to see Gabriel was saying that we have to learn from COVID. Yes, we have to learn from COVID. If you take the whole cost of the economic investments that were done by Europe or US, you have 10,000 billions that were injected in the economy. The global cost of vaccination to vaccinate everybody is 50 billions. Why do we have this possibility to invest 10,000 and not invest 50 billion? I see Tarun and COVAX, which is a success at a certain level, had the goal of having 1.3 billion doses at the end of this year. It will be maybe 800. It's 600 today. Why? Why no investment in massive production or leverage waiver of IP? So we have to face the real question: are we still going in an individual reward, the winner take all, and we are still in this context, or are we moving to a community reward where we think of using this technology to reduce inequalities, to reduce suffering, and to implement human flourishing, as you said at the beginning? It's also the question of what kind of societies, national and international, we want to. Is it that solidarity is getting back, or is it still that individualism and fragmentation will be the driver? And I think that for neurotechnology, which is going to be a very individualized, a very personalized treatment, this question of individuals first or community first is going to be crucial. And all what we are going to design as policies are going to depend on what kind of trends we want to adopt.
Thank you, Hervé. We're getting some fascinating questions from our participants in this session. And I suppose before, because we are running out of time, so there is an issue I do want to address with the panel, and that's been raised by, as I say, some of our participants, which is how can we prevent that neurotechnologies kind of serve to enforce very narrow norms of how the brain should work, and also I suppose that comes back to making sure that, you know, as we've talked about, that they serve, that the neurotechnologies that are being developed will actually serve or at least address justice concerns, and especially amongst those who might be suffering a disability. So Philip, I'd like to ask for your view on that, because I think it's a fascinating question about, kind of goes back to, you know, we're designing technologies, but around a sort of existing idea of how the brain should look, how it should function, and how appropriate is that? And I suppose it very much ties in with an earlier point that we discussed, which is about inclusivity and diversity in terms of how these technologies are developed. So Philip, do you mind giving us maybe some of your thoughts in respect of how do we ensure that we protect diversity and innovation while we're developing these technologies?
Yes, I think it's a very crucial point, not only protecting diversity, but making diversity a central tenet of neurotechnological innovation. And one way to achieve this is if you step back and not look at the brain in isolation, in a sort of neuro-essentialist perspective in which we can sort of solve all the problems by somehow intervening in the brain. But if we take this wider sort of embedded sociocultural perspective and look at brains and human beings in interaction, we can already see that we can take a much more inclusive and diverse approach in terms of the kinds of behaviors, the kinds of neurological setups that we find out there in the world. And I think I think a top-down approach by which we build a kind of idealized model of how the brain should work would be the utterly wrong approach, but we need more of a bottom-up, inclusive and diverse perspective to look at how to cherish and really and take the diversity that we find in the world as our starting point to look at very granular ways in which we can help specific people in whatever whatever their needs, their capabilities, and their vulnerabilities are. And so we need to take a holistic perspective to look at the whole person, their neurobiology, their psychology, their anthropology, and the brain is just one part of that. And insofar as targeted and specific and evidence-based, I need to stress it again, interventions into the brain can help to achieve this goal, all the better. I wanted to make one small point, because I think it's important on the notion of ethical self-regulation by companies, because I'm a little bit more skeptical in that regard, because obviously if the environment and the discourses are changing and there's pushback, backlash against companies to be more sensitive about the way that they use data, they will shift their messaging and they will shift their sort of appearance to appease this pressure. But I've yet to see companies take a very, very progressive and proactive approach to shaping this agenda. So I'm largely seeing reactive approaches in which we get societal pushback, often driven by outrageous scandals like by Cambridge Analytica and so forth, and then companies adjust their internal policies and their messages. And I think companies could do better by making sort of ethics, self-reflection, human rights-based approaches a core part of their identity, and not just a convenient add-on for virtue signaling, ethics washing if the pressure gets too high. So it's just a sort of added message. But yeah.
So we're coming to the end of our session, unfortunately, because it's been really fascinating. Thank you all so much for your contributions. And I'd like to thank all of the participants in this session for the really interesting questions that we have being posed from the audience. I suppose I'd like to finish off by saying, so we've covered a huge amount of ground, I suppose, in this session. So if I would ask each of you kind of in under a minute to kind of sum up what you think the key messages for you are in respect of how do we promote responsible neurotechnology for brain health. So I'll start with you, Tarun.
Thanks, Siobhan, and thanks to the panelists and actually to the very interesting questions that I'm seeing into the chat. So one key take-home message from this discussion for me is about this co-creation of any policy that we are talking about. So I think we need to bring all stakeholders around the table, at global level, at regional level, and national level, to address issues that we were talking about, the issues related to access, the issues related to affordability, the issues related to equity, the issues that are relevant as value proposition, incentives. I think all of these taking a criteria-based approach. So, and having that co-creation model, that will be very important. The second take-home message is that we need to have a good monitoring and accountability mechanisms. So in terms of like how what is coming out, what is the impact that we are seeing, what could be the risks that are coming through, and unless and until we think through and having a good indicator framework in terms of monitoring the neurotechnology, we would not be able to course correct that may be required, and that we need a close. And the third message for me is a close tie-up between research and from research to the field, to the point of care. I think that, yeah.
Tarun, that's really good. Due to my poor management, unfortunately, because I was so interested and kept talking, so I would ask other contributors to be brief. Maybe one key message, Gabriel?
Yeah, sure. Well, I think the key message here is that we need some kind of framework, some ethical framework that we could all agree. I think what Diana is doing with Asilomar, it's a great idea. We need that in neurotechnology. We need to bring together all the stakeholders and agree to avoid ethical relativism and to know where we can stand and what we cannot do, what is totally out of the way. So I think that is a must-have to concretize this kind of guidelines. And the other thing is that we need to increase education to the stakeholders. We need to create more courses around this. And lastly, I think that we shouldn't take out the structural problems that are related to neurotechnology, and this is access to the technology per se. What everybody was saying, we need to change that in the short term. I think it's more of a capitalism way, that way things are done is due to the intrinsic problem that we have with capitalism, but well, that's another discussion. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Gabriel. Hervé, your one take-home message?
I should say that OECD 457 is the first step, but need to be implemented. For that, we need an inclusive process with the various UN bodies and international bodies, but also in an inclusive way, professional organization from the academic sector, from the private sector. And finally, I should suggest that we need all this process to be informed, and we should think about creating some kind of IPCC of neurotechnology or IPCC of technologies, because we absolutely need an international, trustworthy groups of scientists and people who know the field to really inform the basis of these policies.
Thank you. Philip.
Thanks. An inclusive, broad and diverse ethics discourse on how we should develop and use neurotechnologies is absolutely essential, but it's not enough. What we need is also an actionable human rights-based approach to regulation and governance that addresses neurotechnology development and use at all levels, in the clinical domain, in the consumer domain, national context, international context, to protect users from adverse effects of neurotechnology use, but also unlock the potential of neurotechnologies for human flourishing and capabilities. So key message would be we need a human rights-based approach.
Thank you. And I'll end up with you, Diana, your key message from today's session.
Thank you. Well, on behalf of BrainMind, I would just like to invite all of you that are watching this panel to think about how you can engage with recommendations for neurotechnology innovation like those published by the OECD. It does have to be a conscious choice. Regulation won't be enough, self-governance won't be enough. Asilomar can be part of the solution, and creating a living international independent organization should be part of the solution. So I applaud the OECD for hosting this meeting and for getting these conversations started.
Thank you all so much. It's been a fascinating session. I'd like to thank our participants for joining us. And also to thank Marcello Janka, who's going to be the rapporteur for this session, who's going to draw together all these very disparate threads for us. So again, thank you to the OECD, and I wish you all a very good afternoon. Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.